everybody. Welcome to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from my little nutshell of infinite space, right here in the Wood of the Holly, below the sign. And on the other side of the hill where that sign lives is one of the great institutions of modern popular culture known as Warner Brothers. And that's fitting today because on the other side of this digital divide, I have an author and a historian and a professor. He dwells at the very pinnacle of academia at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and he's the author of a brand new book that is dear to my heart called The Warner Brothers. Welcome to A Rebel Without Applause, fitting title too, also a Warner Brothers movie, taken from a Warner Brothers movie. Welcome to my show, Chris Yogerst. How you doing, man?
Thank you. Good to be here.
And for those of you that don't know, the theme that I was playing on the licorice was As Time Goes By, which was probably the most important piece of music ever composed at Warner Brothers, played by Dooley Wilson in the great movie Casablanca. So let me just start with a real simple question to kick this off. And by the way, the book is great. I read it. Takes you really across the 20th century in many ways. But why Warner Brothers?
One way I always like to answer this is that, I saw Goodfellas growing up, and I listened to Martin Scorsese talk about growing up and watching Cagney, and that kind of led me to Cagney and the gangsters and the Warner Brothers.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, that's what led me to Warner Brothers. What led me to the book was kind of what you alluded to, the studio and the kinds of movies they made and the types of personalities that were there and the types of personalities that the brothers had represented so much of the 20th century. Through the studio, you can know nothing about 20th century America. And reading my book, you'll learn a whole lot about what was going on just because the Warner Brothers were always engaging in their surrounding culture and politics and social issues and trying to weigh in on the issues of the day.
As a primer to your great book, watch the movies. Put Turner Classics on your cable menu and watch the movies because they're fantastic. And full disclosure, the whole Warner Brothers story has very powerful resonance for me personally because my grandfather, Ben Kalmanson, was president of Warner Brothers and started in 1927, selling celluloid, nitrate, which could blow up in projectors all across the country, kill projectionists, and retiring from the studio as president in 1969. My grandfather was from Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, was Jewish, was born in Russia, Lithuania, and it sort of mirrors the brothers Warner. So I even met Jack Warner, came to my bar mitzvah. He was sitting there. My grandfather brought 3 guests. My grandmother, who he didn't really care that much about, sadly, because she was wonderful, and Jack Warner, and also one of the signature great directors of Warner Brothers, and that was Mervyn LeRoy. And they all looked alike. They all had cigars, and they all loved the racetrack. They all looked like gangsters. And if I'd known anything then, when I was 13, I would have just not talked to anybody except Mervyn LeRoy and asked him about I'm a fugitive from a chain gang.
Oh, absolutely.
and
what's funny with LeRoy, right? He was a good friend of Jack's and then ended up marrying Harry's daughter, right? Doris.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting the connections within this.
This is at once a story of a dysfunctional family, betrayal. It's a story of the unholy marriage between art and commerce and politics and popularity. And I'm sure that as a professor, it had to have been extremely interesting to you.
Absolutely. So much written about the Warner Brothers ends up deviating to the movies and the stars really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And they end up becoming like the secondary characters in their own story. And the more I learned about the brothers, the more I found them infinitely more fascinating than the stars, just because everything that you see on screen originated somewhere on some level from the brothers. Their attitudes, the kinds of movies that got greenlit were the kinds of movies that were based on issues that either Jack and Harry were passionate about or on social trends they felt were relevant. They dabble in horror and they dabble in Westerns and they make, A Midnight Summer's Dream, which is, Warner Brothers trying to do an impersonation of MGM. They still knew enough to, try these things. But like you mentioned, A Fugitive from a Chain Gang. Before we were talking, we mentioned Public Enemy before we were recording and Casablanca, but it's like, I feel like I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang might be the most quintessential Warner Brothers movie to really cut to the spine of what Warner Brothers was, just because it was so raw and of the moment and really mirroring the struggle that audience were feeling in 1932, on the other side of the screen.
And of course, Mervyn LeRoy directed it. Paul Muni, who was a star from the Yiddish theater, otherwise known as Muni Weisenfreund, starred in it. It was basically a true story. As a matter of fact, I believe the character, the real person, helped with the movie. It was also sort of an assault on racism and the cruelty of the South and the prison farm system. And it's a chilling movie. It is a great movie to this day.
It still packs a punch.
It's a great movie, and Mervyn LeRoy is almost like sort of the quintessential pre-war Warner Brothers director. One of the things about your book that I really enjoyed was their Nickelodeon period in Pennsylvania, where they're really just a family looking for a niche in this new exploding American economy, the origin story of the brothers Warner. Talk about that.
That was actually probably one of the more difficult parts of the book to write, just because there's no template to jump from. Almost everything on Warner Brothers starts in 1923, maybe 1918, when they get My 4 Years of Germany off the ground and they adapt that into a successful movie. But it's like they had been in the business since 1905. So there was a lot of stuff before that. So, and that's one thing I always like to remind people. It's like, yeah, it's the centennial of Warner Brothers this year, 100 years of incorporation. But by the time they were incorporated as Warner Bros., they were old dogs, right? Like they had a ton of experience, successes, failures, running theaters, running distribution chains. They were learning the production process, and they pioneered stuff. I mean, they did what some books, and as far as I can tell, was the first roadshow film when they found Dante's Inferno, that no one had the rights on it, so they could play it and have somebody read from the book and do all this kind of stuff and make it a real roadshow experience. That gives us a sense of, in the teens, where they were in the late 20s, still trying to make something new with movies, right? By the late 20s was with sound, but they've been doing that all along, trying to take this medium and try to keep it fresh. They were fearless in their innovation and their the desire to learn, even through failure. When they get shut down by Thomas Edison and his trust and the patents company and all this kind of stuff, that didn't stop them. They built another company.
Right.
So it was a fascinating period. When you read through it in the book, you will really get a sense of why they became so strong and badass by the 30s.
And what's interesting is that, it's a little counterintuitive, but when we look back, that most of these companies started really with exhibition. They were exhibitors, and they needed to find stuff to put in these projectors, and the Warner Brothers were no different. They started as exhibitors. I think that's a little bit overlooked today, because if you wanted to make money in movies, you had to sell tickets. You had to find a way to sell and put these movies in theaters. At first, some theaters you might have owned, but other theaters. And you had to have a way of collecting them, the money, the box office receipts. You had to have a way of monitoring the exhibitors to make sure that they weren't stealing that much.
Yeah.
And you had to ship prints, and it was a very complicated business endeavor. And my grandfather was, you don't see his name on any movie credits, but really he was one of the big machers on distribution. And so from his origin story in Pittsburgh, where he was selling cars, and the local Warner Brothers guy says, "You're a really smart Jew. Why don't you come work for me?" And he goes, "Well, let me try. Well, go here into Western Pennsylvania and see if you can hear some info and see if you can book some of these movies." And so my grandfather took a banjo and started singing songs to these. This is like right before the jazz singer. And he comes back, he goes, "Are you kidding me? This business is easy. I'm in." Because he had booked all these movies into these theaters. Well, I mean, literally within decades, he's sitting at the top of the food chain in distribution at Warner Brothers. So the other brothers he was quite close with. And I'm just reviewing my grandfather's story. And I'm curious to know what you may have discovered. But by the 50s and 60s, he's really at the pinnacle of the company. Jack Warner takes him extremely serious. He's kind of a genius of the business in a way. But, he's not making movies. He's not greenlighting them. But he might say, get rid of Ann Sheridan. I can't look at her. She's worked Jack in West Virginia. Put this, so that kind of input was important, because after all, that was the only revenue stream. There's no video. There's no streaming. Right. There's no television, anything. It's celluloid and projectors. So I think that part of the business is overlooked. Talk about the film exchanges and what that was and what it meant, because you mentioned that especially early in the book.
Right. Well, and just to piggyback on what you were saying, I mean, that, talking the other week, I didn't know how far back Ben went in the company. I mean, in my research, he shows up in the 50s in a pretty big spot. So it went to reason that he probably, had been, he didn't just show up in the 50s. But yeah, I mean, there's a fascinating history with this guy that I need to put in the preface to the paperback. But the exchanges, I mean, that's what's interesting. So they started with opening a couple theaters, and then, they have whatever movies they can find. Eventually that runs its course and they need to get more movies. So they start reaching out to these exchanges and getting movies, and they're paying for movies, and then they're paying people to see the movies. Then they need to give money back to rent the movie. And, so then they learn that, oh, wait, the real money is in these exchanges. So now they start opening, trying to get into those networks. They worked for Laemmle, they worked for Lowe. They did a really good job, really at every stage of this early period in working and perfecting the skills in every job before they moved up. So before they had like successful distribution, well, at least one of the brothers was tied to distribution, working in it, knew somebody who was working in it. And then they started the Duquesne amusement supply company, and that's the one that got shut down by Edison. They were really perfecting distribution while simultaneously Jack and Sam, who were the younger two, and they were still pretty young, they started dabbling in production, and they rented spaces in the Midwest, and they started making movies. And even the brothers said it was pretty much all garbage. And it probably was, but they were learning the process, right? Just like they had with the exhibition. So by the time they rent their properties in Los Angeles, they have firsthand real life experience at every single level of this vertically integrated industry.
And what year is that? 1918, 17?
They moved to LA in like 1917.
Okay, so World War I's coming to an end. I guess they had a previous studio when I read your book, but the one that is on Sunset Boulevard where KTLA Television was, and right next to Netflix, sadly, was the original studio.
They had one piece of property. I could not find exactly where it was. The only detail I had is it was near the Sea League Zoo, wherever that was. But that was very, very short-lived before then they got the Sunset Studios and started building more buildings there. You said World War I's coming to an end, so they option, and this is their, ripping from the headlines thing, right? World War I, the ambassador Gerard has a book. It's popular. Let's option that. Let's make that into a movie. So that was their first hit. They were already trying to get on the zeitgeist. And that was also within right about the first years they were actually using Warner Bros.
As a title.
And that stuck. Yep.
I'm sitting in Beechwood Canyon at a place called Crotona where I live. Doris Day lived across the hall from me. It's a place that was a theosophical retreat built in 1914. So I'm living in the garden of Allah splendor of old Hollywood under the sign. But I can only imagine what a beautiful and rustic and rural and exciting place this must have been, Los Angeles.
I love Beechwood Canyon. Every time I come to LA, I take a trip there. I stop at the Beechwood Cafe, and there's little pieces around LA that still have that old-timey feel, right? And Beechwood Canyon is one of them. If you read a lot of film history, there are parts where you can stand and just look around and feel, it's almost like you can see into the past a little bit, or you can feel the past resonating. And it's similar walking around the Warner Brothers lot, right? Like you can feel that, the orange groves were still around, and
Sunset Boulevard was largely a horse trail.
Right.
That wound its way to the sea.
Yeah, the bridle path was there. And, one of the only places Musso and Frank's probably wasn't even there yet, or was just opening.
Yeah, just opening, and they're still open. I maybe go there tomorrow for a steak. Yeah, that's the world that I live in. And if you get a chance to see the movie that I directed, there's a little bit of that percolating out of my romantic mockery. Now, to me, I'm going to just say this, and then I'm going to backtrack. I'm going to barrel through a list of these movies for people that really haven't lived in this. And I was going to pick my top 10, but I couldn't. So I'm going to start.
It's impossible. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just think the first star is Rin Tin Tin, where they finally find something that starts to generate some real public awareness. I don't know if those movies exist. They may. I'm not sure.
They do.
They do.
Quite a few of them are on YouTube. You can go find them. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Which was sort of a take on the Jack London novel, which was about Red Fang, I think, or White Fang.
Yeah.
Which was popular. So they're like, okay, Jack London with White Fang, Rin Tin, how I don't know.
And also them just knowing, like, this is something that's popular. Let's do our version of it, right?
Yeah. Dogs. They don't renegotiate. We can do that,
Right. Easiest stars to deal with.
Yeah. So here's my list. So for getting Rin Tin Tin, I'm going to start with such an iconic movie, and I really want to get into it because it cuts in so many directions. And that is, of course, The Jazz Singer, followed by I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, Barbara Stanwyck and Babyface, Mark Hellinger's The Roaring Twenties, Little Caesar, The Public Enemy. Max Reinhardt visits Hollywood from Germany and directs A Midsummer Night's Dream, where they basically steal a big part of what would become the MGM roster. 42nd Street, You're Going Out a Youngster, You've Got to Come Back a Star, The Forgotten Man and Gold Diggers of 33, Paul Muni in The Life of Emile Zola, Yankee Doodle Dandy, The Petrified Forest, Here's to You, Duke, You're the Last Great Apostle of Rugged Individualism, Angels with Dirty Faces, Sergeant York, really an interesting movie in many ways because it explores these ideas of nonviolence, The Maltese Falcon, High Sierra, The Treasure of Sierra Madre, The Letter, Casablanca, White Heat, Mildred Pierce, Key Largo, A Streetcar Named Desire, Ba-da-ba-doo-ba-dee-da. A Star is Born, Sid Luft and Judy Garland's collaboration with Warner Brothers, I think, to make one of probably the greatest movies ever made about show business. And then East of Eden, Giant, Rebel Without a Cause, which is the inspiration for my podcast, A Rebel Without Applause, A Face in the Crowd, Mr. Roberts, Splendor in the Grass, Baby Doll, The Searchers, My Fair Lady, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, PT 109 from those Nixon supporting Kennedys, who knew? Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, The Dirty Dozen, Bonnie and Clyde, which my grandfather greenlit, Bullet, Cool Hand Luke, The Wild Bunch, The Green Berets, A Look Rightward from John Wayne, Full Metal Jacket, Kubrick's opus, Lethal Weapon, which I have a one line in and I'm in and I still get residuals, Argo, which won Best Picture, and I'm in it also. And of course, that most memorable movie that nobody knows about that I wrote and directed, but was acquired by Warner Brothers, The Solar Opposite. That's the 20th century right there.
Right. Well, and you could go all day listing awesome movies from Warner's past, just because there's so many. And I mean, in the 30s, they were making, there were some years it was like 80 movies a year or so. I mean, it's ridiculous. And yeah, just hearing you read off that list, it's just like, yep. I mean, every one of those, there's something. It's like the second you hear the title, you remember an image or a line, or some of them you said, and it's like, and that's one of the things that was tricky with the book. It's like, what can I add? But for something like Rebel Without a Cause, that I was able to get into, how that movie right before it came out was caught up in Estes Kefauver after he tried to take down a mob, right? He goes after juvenile delinquency and fingers the movies as the biggest culprit. Jack Warner goes and defends the industry. And it's a really kind of funny back and forth where Kefauver's like, well, I heard this movie is, pretty awful and pretty bad at, egging on these delinquents. And Jack's like, well, it's not even done. I don't know how you've seen it.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. Yeah. And I think that touches on your other book, Hollywood Hates Hitler.
That wasn't, so yeah, it was in the 50s with
the Hugh Adams.
But yeah, Hollywood Hates Hitler. Well, and that's what Harry, right, is the one defending the studio, the isolationist senators right before World War II go after Hollywood for making anti-Nazi movies because they are arguing they're trying to push us into this war that we don't belong in and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, Harry goes to Washington and stands up for the movies there. And of course, Jack does that again in the 50s.
People underestimate today how much pro-Nazi sentiment there was. We see that in different ways today. The pro-fascist thing is still alive and well, just like hundreds of thousands of Southerners willingly and thrillingly marched to their death to defend slavery. So those strains in our society never go away.
Right. And Warner Brothers reminds us of that. And that's why I've tried to make real clear in my book, as I did in Hollywood Hates Hitler, but that one, there's multiple studios, there's more going on where with just the Warners, I could really focus on how they were really leading the way in calling this stuff out. Hitler comes to power. They pull their product out of Germany. So, you got to look at how courageous that was because you're dealing with the Great Depression. Germany's a lucrative market. No one really wants to lose Germany's revenue at the worst part of the Depression in 1933, but Warner Brothers were strong enough in their dedication to fighting this stuff to say, we're out, we're done with it, we're not going to do business with this country. And then not long after that, they start making these anti-authoritarian movies and eventually culminates with Confessions of a Nazi Spy.
Right.
And right, there are all these rules, you with the Hays Code, you couldn't ridicule other nations. So there's some bad history out there floating around that's got into the water supply that's argued that, well, the studios were working with Hitler and, because they weren't making anti-Nazi movies. It's like, well, they couldn't, because their movies wouldn't get released until they just, the Warner Brothers decided to break the dam and say, screw it, we're going to make this movie.
And it's 1933 is early because that's the year Hitler comes to power. So it's not like 38 or at the brink of war, they're making a stand. They're anticipating what's to come. Let's talk about The Jazz Singer, because to me, this movie is really, more than any movie, the closest to the Warner Brothers family story in a way, because it's a story about the son of a cantor who gives up the faith to embrace the popular culture, which is jazz. And he's the jazz singer. This is a Jewish family that comes out of Europe. It's a story of assimilation, and it's also a story of triumph and tragedy, because they lose the great pioneer technical brother, Sam. So I think that movie's worth seeing because it's actually great.
It is. Before I wrote the book, I had seen parts of it, and I never actually watched it all the way through, and I didn't really know what to expect. But yeah, by the end, I was surprised that it wasn't just like one of those movies you need to see because it's historically significant. It's actually good and interesting, and the performances are great. And the more you know about the Warner Brothers, the more the movie stands out as a really unique choice for them. I know they had been really good in the years, almost decade before that, optioning popular books and plays and things like that. So they're already swimming in those circles, knowing what was popular to adapt into film. But the fact that this one wasn't just a popular play, but it was about a Jewish family, right? Like you said, it connects to them in this, really surprisingly specific way, and really represents the family in a lot of ways. I mean, there wasn't as much of a rift between like dad and the children, but there was that rift, right, between Jack and the older brothers. I mean, like, so there were all these things where if they weren't exactly the way they were in the movie, they were there in one way or another in the Warner family. and right, you have this push and pull between faith and art and commerce and business and all of this that, Jack definitely was, I don't know if he was on the fence about his faith, but he was very selective in when he put it on his sleeve and not, as opposed to Harry, who was always very forward on his faith.
Jack was a member of a cult. It's called Jews for Gentile Girls. And that, the basic philosophy was, hey, if God chose me, I don't see why you can't. And that apparently, drove his brothers and his parents crazy.
Right. Yeah. He wasn't as dedicated to his faith or his family as everyone else would have liked him to have been. But was still, I mean, credit where it's due, right? Was a great producer, was really had a really good eye for content, still played a very important role, very essential role in the company. But it's all the backdoor tensions that makes it even more kind of fascinating. And of course, that's what's so tragic about this. As you mentioned, Sam, right? Sam dies right before this comes out, and he was the big proponent for sound and all of that. But even more importantly for the Warners, he was the bridge between Jack and the rest of the family. Like, he was the younger brother that could understand Jack and get along with Jack, that traveled a lot. But he also had a great respect for the rest of his family and his older brothers that Jack didn't really have. And he provided this bridge between them. And as soon as Sam died, that was lost. And that kind of sets up this like incredible tragedy to come decades later. I mean, this is the whole thing is an example of why it's harder for me to read fiction, just because nonfiction can be so absolutely insane, and this real story is as crazy as anything somebody could write.
Yeah, and also it's a story of assimilation into the larger culture, which of course, just some. I'm sure you read that Neil Gabler book. What was the World of
Empire of Their Own?
Empire of Their Own, where they not only integrate with the larger society or whatever white Protestants, they actually kind of invent it as well.
Right. Yeah. They were definitely purveyors of American images. And even Sam, we were just talking about him. I mean, he was also assimilating a lot. I mean, his wife was Catholic, right? And they were, I mean, he used that to the advantages that he could, where it was hard for them to get a realtor to show them homes, if they thought he was Jewish, but if they saw his wife's crucifix, they could get tours.
Yes. Yeah.
So it was one of those deals where it was like, well, I'm not going to deal with the anti-Semitism today. I don't blame him. It was all a part of this process of like, where's the balance, right? How are we going to, get along in this country? When are we going to dig our heels in? When are we going to roll with it? And that was something that the brothers, especially Harry, was always in the front of his mind. He was often talking to other studio heads and friends and family, and would often give talks on the lot about just encouraging people to be aware of the world, to build bridges to other people, to understand everyone, to bridge differences, all this kind of stuff that was just so essential to who he was, and I think essential to what Warner Brothers is.
And that's sort of an embrace of this inclusive liberal impulse that really animates the movies, the studio, until after World War II. There's a sea change, I think.
They were kind of bitten by the Red Scare. I mean, there's a couple movies, right? Big Jim McClane and these like Red Scare movies. But when you look at the kind of stuff, even as the older brothers retire, and even after Harry dies, I mean, Jack is still green-lighting pretty socially liberal movies, right? Even when he becomes, big Nixon supporter, he's greenlighting Baby Doll and The Nun's Story, and which really irked the Catholics. I go into that story. Baby Jane and Virginia Woolf and all these movies, right? So even you've got this guy who kind of goes to the right. He's still very socially liberal in the kinds of stuff he's greenlighting.
And very vigorous in the defense of those stories once
Absolutely.
they're made. As a matter of fact, when Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf came out, of course, one of their talents was identifying great directors. And Virginia Woolf is, of course, Mike Nichols. But Kazan is a giant. I mean, Kazan is one of the just titans of movie making. And if you want to talk about fascism in America, go watch A Face in the Crowd. And here's a nod to Columbia Studios, Frank Capra's Meet John Doe. What a great double feature, because it really anticipates a lot of, what we've seen in the last 6 to 8 years. So he embraces some of the biggest talents, and talent seeks talent is my view. And it's animates some of my own screenplays. I had a thought. Oh, yeah. So
good at I was just going to say, they're always good at recognizing talent and recognizing a specific kind of talent. Because like I talk about in my book, like in the 1920s, they were the studio that brought Ernst Lubitsch in and all this, but they realized there are things they didn't like about him, but they, he didn't really mesh with Warner Brothers and the kinds of movies they wanted to make, but they recognized the talent. They let him go. They started bringing in people, they started building Zanuck, right? And Zanuck, along with some other producers, Brian Foy and others, got really good at finding these movies that were ripping from the headlines. And of course, when Zanuck goes to Fox, he's able to, gentleman's agreement, right? It's a movie that would have been made at Warner Brothers. And Jack is still really good at finding those kinds of people towards the end of his career. And Kazan,
Al Wallace.
Yeah.
Hal Wallace, Jerry Wald.
Yep.
Here's a story. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is in, I don't know, was that 65, 66? It's a hit play. Mike Nichols with big stars directs a fantastic movie. It's really fantastic. Sam Osteen edits it. I forget who the cinematographer was. It was a great, great movie. And of course, like you say, they have a run-in with the Catholic Legion of Decency, which is the prevailing censorship body. And they've got this finished movie. Now, my grandfather is he didn't have an accent. He was born in Russia, but he came here very young. He was fit the profile of like a gangster more than the Jewish immigrant. You couldn't find him at Temple unless he was there at gunpoint. So he's there representing Warner Brothers with the Catholic Legion of Decency. He's got, we don't want this, and this isn't appropriate, and this isn't good. And the guy on the other side was this lawyer. You mentioned him in your book, Louis Nizer.
Yep.
And Nizer's takeaway, and I remember reading this, was that the Warner Brothers refused to back down and make these cuts. And he was only thankful that Ben Kalmanson didn't write scripts for Warner Brothers, because my grandfather was famous for being able to unleash almost a poetic David Mamet-like tirade of curses that set him on his back, and that preserved whatever was objectionable about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Of course, today it seems pretty tame, but then it was different. He was also, my grandfather was close with Kazan.
Jack had been dealing with the Legion of Decency since the 30s. And by the late 50s, that started, their power started to crumble, right? I mean, Baby Doll was definitely a movie where, this was one where Jack was able to defend it by getting away with some of the content by putting an adults only label on it. This is before we have the rating system, right? So it's like, if you can guarantee exhibitors, like, all right, let's just, as adults only, that will, bridge the issue with some of the censors. He did the same thing with the Nun's Story, where, he went to Rome to convince some of the higher ups in the Catholic Church that this wasn't an anti-Catholic movie. It was a movie about somebody who was leaving the faith to save their family during wartime, not because they didn't like the faith.
Right.
But right by the time you get to Virginia Woolf and whatever happened to Baby Jane, it's the same thing. Jack is really, really a stalwart defender of the movies and the content. Even back in the 40s, things that were really tame. The censors came at them for, I think it was an Air Force, where they wanted some really like tame lines out, like "damn 'em" or something like that. And he wrote back to Joel Breen saying, like, you don't think our soldiers talk like this?
Yeah.
In fact, they say a whole lot more than this.
That's what John Garfield, right? Air Force, I think.
Yeah. Yep. And, so that just, that shows you the type of sense that Warner and Kalmanson and everybody in his circle, they were interested in the realism, right? Like if something that was in the movie mirrors something real in the world today, they wanted it in the movie. I always love your story about your grandpa's colorful language. I'm sure he was really, really fun to have a beer with.
He was a tough guy. He was not, the most loving family man. I don't think I had one conversation with him about the movies. And I wish I was too little. If he'd managed to hang in there just 10 more years, I might have gotten a few introductions. Instead, get to the back of the line. Kalmanson. I did have one experience. One of the great movies for Warner Brothers is Bonnie and Clyde. So there's this new generation of filmmakers. Arthur Penn and in this case, Warren Beatty, really the filmmaker, even though he's the producer. Warren had made a good movie for Warner Brothers with Kazan, Splendor in the Grass, which is a great movie. It's heartbreaking with Natalie Wood. And he's got this story, and it's Vietnam is raging. And the print the legend story is, at that time, my grandfather was, sitting at the top of the food chain. And Warren crawls into his office begging to make this movie. Like, Jack says, go talk to Benny. I don't know. Bullshit. Fucking goddamn. Well, what do I know about the fucking gangster? Bonnie and Clyde. Wait. So he goes into my grandfather's office and he crawls in, and the story as it was related is my grandfather's get the fuck off the floor. What are you doing? He goes, I got to make this picture. Bonnie and Clyde, get the fuck out of my office. Go make the movie. Don't fucking bother me. He's back on the racing form. So he greenlights the movie, and I know that there's some real truth to that because some years later, I was invited to a Directors Guild screening of Reds when it was going to DVD. And I had not long before made my own movie, The Solar Opposite. Warren Beatty walks into the little pre-party and I have my little name tag, Bill Kalmanson. And I say, hey, Warren, I'm Bill Kalmanson. My grandfather was Ben. And cameras are clicking. He's a superstar. This is a great movie, not a Warner Brothers movie, but a spectacular achievement in movie making and directing and even acting. And he hugs me like, no, my God, your grandfather, Ben, like he held, and it's like, he was the guy, he was, and I had a similar moment with Kazan when I was a young actor in New York where I saw him and I mentioned that. So that was the connection to that kind of the post-war revolution.
And that's an important, adding to the kind of the legend of Bonnie and Clyde, right? Because, a lot of people have talked about the tension between Beatty and Jack Warner. But one of the things that I add is apparently one of the reasons that Jack had an issue with Beatty is that apparently after Splendor in the Grass, Jack wanted Beatty to play in PT 109. And Beatty didn't want to do it. He apparently held that grudge then forever. And that might have been even a bigger reason why Jack didn't like Bonnie and Clyde, because, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. I should have been more explicit about this in the book, that Jack didn't get Bonnie and Clyde because he was really good at understanding the changing times. I think he just was still pissed at Beatty for not doing PT 109 because Jack was trying to get in good with JFK.
PT 109 I saw recently again, and it's a good movie. It's a very good war movie, and it's really a good movie about the nature of leadership. One of the things I want to throw at you is Bonnie and Clyde is very much lives in the revolt that's percolating in our society during the 60s, and Vietnam is looming right over it. And there's two movies that were Warner Brothers that not necessarily Jack Warner was involved with, but The Green Berets and Full Metal Jacket.
What's interesting about this is because, yeah, Jack not really connected to either one, but there is something about the type of movie that ends up at Warner Brothers for any number of reasons. Sometimes I think there's just like a historical energy that brings it in. And right, you've got, yeah, Full Metal Jacket is the kind of movie that if there was a 1940s version of it, you know, it would have ended up at Warner Brothers. You know, if there was a World War II version of this kind of, you know, war story. And yeah, there's just something about these kinds of movies that seem to track back to the Warner Brothers past. Really, both of them. I mean, Full Metal Jacket in terms of like the hard-hitting realism of it, and then Green Berets in terms of the kind of shameless propaganda, right? Because they had those war movies too during World War II. So, right, you know, both of these seem to connect quite conveniently to Warner's history.
Actually, I watched Green Berets recently, and it is a shameless pro-Vietnam sort of holding, you know, the wall against the grim reapers of communism movie. But, you know, they allow for the opposing opinions to be expressed in the press, within the movie. And so, you know, ultimately the argument is the brutality of the communists means we have to take these measures. But one of the questions I have for you is, you know, in the process of researching this book, what kind of help did you get from the studio?
None.
Okay.
Actually.
Was that because they didn't like screw you, get out of here, or
not really. No, they're you know, I did all this research. I mean, part of it was the pandemic. I was finishing this book during the pandemic. Everything was shut down. I was actually, before the pandemic, I was connected to somebody who was going to be able to get me connected somewhere. Basically what I was trying to find out is what is in the actual archives on the lot. What's there that isn't at USC and at the Herrick and everywhere else. I wasn't able to break through that, so I might still try for future editions. But no, I mean, almost everything I did was archival work at archives all around the country, digital databases, stuff that's been newly available and scanned and things like that. Nothing from the studio, but if there's more information, I won't turn it away.
I don't even know today what Warner Brothers is, because the people's faith in theatrical motion pictures has been diminished by the marvelization, I think, of movies, the serialization, the rise of the agent class, you know, the packaging. You know, you got to kind of show up with everything done. I don't know who to go to, because I've written 9 other screenplays in addition to the one I made. Go, hey, let me take you to the promised land. Let me be Jerry Wald here. Let me lead you to something really interesting with other stuff that I've written. I don't really know where I can get that conversation at Warner Brothers.
Yeah, it's a weird time. I mean, I would say up until recently, there were still connections to Warner past. If you look at filmmakers like Christopher Nolan and Clint Eastwood that have long connections to the studio, right? Like these are the kinds of filmmakers that it seems like Warner Brothers history would project this kind of possibility. Right now, we're just in a weird time for movies, right? Where it's not just Warner Brothers, but it's like movies are searching for an identity. And a lot of times this comes up, and even my students will ask us questions around like, you know, are movies going to last? And a lot of times I just go back to history. It's like movies have been pronounced dead time and time again. I mean, like when Warner Brothers did The Jazz Singer, people were saying movies are over. Once you add sound, movies are done. You know, once TV came in, people said movies were done. Once home video came in, people said movies were done. Once the internet was a thing, people said movies are done. Movies in general have they've survived. They've found ways to survive. But, you know, for those of us that grew up with a certain kind of movie, it's weird to think of, right, that people are watching these great movies on, you know, like a tiny screen, right? Nice. Things like that. But you know, I think this summer was a good example of with Barbie and with Oppenheimer that there is an interest in movies as an event, movies as something bigger than what you see in your living room. I see things like that, and it gives me hope. I suppose.
Well, I think there's a pent up demand for the movie experience. You know, one of the things that's of interest to me, and you know, maybe you can shed light on it, because you know, in the I guess the 50s, with the antitrust. Exhibition was excised from distribution and production, basically. And I kind of feel with all the labor unrest with the writers, and as far as I know, I'm still on strike as of this moment, that we're in for another, depending on the political winds, it's hard to know, another big antitrust action. Because what you see with Netflix, and they're piping it into your TV or your computer, and they're paying for it. And there's this diminishment of labor, whether it's writers or actors, and maybe even directors. Maybe there's another tsunami coming that might come in the way of antitrust. I'm not sure.
I agree. I actually I did a little historical context on this for the Hollywood Reporter about a month ago.
Oh.
And I've been thinking exactly what you were saying. As soon as I'm trying to remember, was it the Writers Guild or was it the Actors Guild that did the press release arguing that Hollywood is vertically integrated again? But you're right. If you look at it in terms of production, distribution, and exhibition, as far as the way they looked at vertical integration in the 40s, if you just, insert certain, 21st century terms back into that, it's the exact same. And I agree. I think that there is, at least what I know from history, it is very much repeating itself in the streaming era. So I would not be surprised if there's another big shakedown over antitrust issues.
Yeah, I mean, you need the political will to do that. And so I'm not sure if that's there yet, but I think it could come.
The pieces are there.
I always have made the case that it's not really been a struggle against Hollywood so much as it's been a struggle against Silicon Valley, this strike. I drove for Uber for a long time. And if I picked you up and took you to the airport and I got $30 to drive you from wherever you're staying to the airport to go back to Minneapolis, and I got $35, I don't know if you paid $50, $75, or $36. I don't know. I might be able to dig way into the algorithms and figure it out. And similarly with subscription and these algorithms and the downloads, the revenue stream is very opaque. And it's more opaque than the Bagelman stuff, with the Hollywood creative accounting. That was famous. Right. You're the creative accountant. I can tell you my experience with my movie. I paid for my movie. I was financed or independently financed, but I'm still trying to earn back the money on the sale however they expensed the DVD on my movie. I'm still in the negative. That's nothing compared to what Netflix, Amazon Prime, Apple Movies. You could see the solar opposite tonight, and I hope you do. But I'll never see whatever.
Right.
$3.99. I'll never see it before the Amazon Prime or Apple or YouTube movies. Then the Warner Brothers who gives it to them. Oh, and Bill who wrote and directed it and raised the money and begged them to forget you, pal. I get a statement that has the money in parentheses, which means you still fucking owe it against your movie. Welcome to Hollywood.
Well, and one thing too with the antitrust stuff, like you said, there's the political will, and and I think with what you're talking about, like with your movie, enough people have seen these situations change and become so opaque in recent years that they're standing up. But one of the things I tried to show in my article is that when all of these decisions came down in 1948, they had been coming for over a decade. Right. So, I mean, there was the long game to actually get that to happen. So, if we're we're in the very beginning of this, it could be another like 10 years before, of course, the way information travels, it's a lot faster now, maybe cut that in half, but it's still, it took time, even when they had pretty much all of the evidence that this stuff was vertically integrated.
Right. And just to litigate that, through the Justice Department, it takes a long time. Just from my experience Ubering, they don't want to give up any information. So all this new innovation felt to me like a new way for exploitation.
Yeah.
But the desire to communicate and tell stories still lives.
Well, and that tracks with what Harry wanted to do all along. I mean, he wanted movies to educate and to entertain.
And the most beautiful thing he ever saw was a line at the box office.
People who wanted to know that next story.
That's what's sort of beautiful about movies. It is this sort of marriage between art and commerce, and you can't really do a movie without an expectation to pay for it. I will say this, the technology's changed, with digitization. At first I didn't like it because I felt the movies looked terrible, but it's way better now. People can make movies on their iPhone The real barrier to entry is distribution and paying for public awareness and creating that. And still, you need, as far as I can see, the powers of these corporations to get in the earballs and eyeballs. What's next, Chris?
I just finished a book about the man who shot Liberty Valance. That'll be out next year.
John Ford.
Yep. And then I just started research on a book on James Cagney.
Cagney's interesting, from White Heat to Yankee Doodle Dandy to The Public Enemy to Ragtime. I'll tell you a great movie that he's in that I think it is 1, 2, 3 with Billy Wilder.
Yeah.
Talk about a Cold War movie.
Right.
The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, I don't believe that was a Warner Brothers movie.
No, that was Paramount.
John Ford.
And you actually referenced it earlier today, but by saying the legend that's printed or something like that. You said
the legend, yeah.
And it's like that's one of the reasons I wanted to do the book, just because even though I've always loved Westerns, the idea of this movie and how we see the past and how we make sense of it resonates both personally in my own life as well as just when I learn about history. I think the sentiment of that movie, printing the legend versus the fact.
John Ford didn't make a lot of movies for Warner Brothers.
When he did The Searchers there.
Searchers, yeah. And also Cheyenne Autumn.
Yep. And Sergeant Rutledge.
With the Woody Strode.
Right. So it's kind of these later career, it also kind of tracks with Warner Brothers, right? The later career, socially conscious movies that deal with issues of the day through the prism of the Old West.
Yeah, I'm working on what is going to be a Western as a script. I've been in 2 years of research.
Awesome.
The big miss on the Westerns as a genre, in my view, is this is a period that really lives from like 1870 to about 1890. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is really at the end of that era, right at the dawn of the 20th century. It lives in the 10 to 25 years after the American Civil War, which is the biggest catastrophe in terms of violence and social upheaval that our country has ever experienced. It was a war that included everybody. So you've got a whole generation of men that fought on the South or the North. Everybody lost people. The mortality was about 700,000. And you've got all these PTSD guys whacked out of their minds, slaughtering Indians. It's a genocidal assault on the wildlife and the animals and the native people. And it's the ravages of unregulated capitalism expanding across the West with the mean fingers of the railroads. But the psyche of the people is completely savage. We saw some really good movies about that after Vietnam, where these vets were just kind of like whacked. But the Westerns don't seem to get that.
Well, they made some really good Westerns, during the Vietnam War, right? Wild Bunch and Lozana's Raid and some of these movies that really used the frontier to comment on the savagery that was going on at the time, right?
Little Big Man, most famously.
And Little Big Man, yeah, of course. And yeah, I think the frontier is always an interesting setting to comment on. It's a historical setting that's used to comment on whatever's going on when the movie's made.
Of course.
And there's some great Red Scare Westerns. There's chunks of time they didn't make a lot of Westerns, like during World War II.
Yeah, my favorite Western looks like a Warner Brothers movie, but it's not, and that's Red River.
Oh, yeah.
Howard Hawks taken to Missouri. And that movie, to me, is it. There's a kind of a dime store novel that's the source of Red River. When you read it, all these guys are coming back from the Civil War, and they're losers. They were fought for the Confederacy. They were Texans.
Well, and it was the same in The Searchers, right? Ethan Edwards was this soldier who defected. Yeah.
Exactly. And the violence is John Wayne actually does it. He internalizes it. It doesn't really bubble out into the text, but he internalizes that race hatred and the anger of a defeated, unreformed Confederate.
Yep.
And it's sort of mitigated at the end, with the girl and everything.
He has these prejudices, but he's very aware of them, and his conflict. You can see this eternal conflict boil over every now and again.
Yeah, and the actor gets it. John Wayne internalized it and made it real. I had a hard time with the movie, honestly. My dad said that's the greatest one. I go, I don't know. I just can't get behind his hatred of the Indians. But when I saw it again, I thought, well, no, you don't have to get behind it, but it's there.
That's a great film. I mean, yeah, that's a movie that takes some time to fully appreciate, especially if you see it. I mean, I saw it when I was pretty young, so I feel like it was one that I liked more as I, grew more and learned more.
So I just feel like the truth of the Civil War is absent from the Westerns. And also the big conundrum in America today is violence and guns and our attachment to guns as a society.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is where another Warner Brothers film, something like Unforgiven with Westerns, right, is great, where you have Clint Eastwood pointing out, like, it's a hell of a thing killing a man, basically telling the young wannabe gunfighter guy, like, this isn't cool. The gunfighters aren't actually heroes. And some old films have done a good job with this. Shane, right, did a good job, right? Like, he has to ride off into the sunset because the family doesn't want to have you over for dinner now because you just killed a bunch of people, even though you saved the town.
And after the war, I mean, by the 60s, sort of these last generation of Warner Brothers movies, I'll tell you a great one is My Fair Lady, which was a musical, and Pygmalion, the adaptation of George Bernard Shaw, beautiful musical, maybe one of the greatest musicals ever made, 42nd Street.
Great.
From 42nd Street to My Fair Lady. Look at that.
Well, the Warner Brothers musicals were like, they even did that their own way. When you look at the 30s musicals, right? Like they're not like the MGM musicals, right? They are raw and just as raw and gritty as their gangster movies. They just have music in them and beautiful choreography.
Right. And the social moment is the Depression. And if this show fails, you're back on the street.
Right. And you mentioned the Forgotten Man number earlier.
Right.
Right. And it's like, that was so much of the moment, these World War I vets, where there was a lot of them that felt forgotten. And that was a real thing that was being talked about in 1933.
Right. Chris, should we do this for like 10 more hours and see how long we can go?
I think we could.
I really have enjoyed this conversation because it's in my wheelhouse and of what I have aspired to and loved, and some of my own frustrations about not fully participating in the way that I dreamt of as a young kid in terms of making my own movies. But I've scratched it a little bit, I do have hope in the theatrical film experience. I think there's a pent-up demand for it. You saw it with these two movies, Oppenheimer and Barbie. I liked them. They were both big accomplishments, especially Oppenheimer. But I felt like that movie, and I'm just going to say it, dwelt too much on the post-war hearings, and the real drama was making the bomb and the teamwork and the pressures and the science behind it. It's like he had all these scenes, shuffled the deck, and Jackson Pollocked them onto the screen like it's a big, look what I did, I'm a genius. I didn't realize that Oppenheimer's family had a ranch in New Mexico, and that's why they went to Los Alamos. Mm-hmm. And so he literally has this idyllic sort of background in the West, and his art comes back to destroy it, because that's where the bomb in Trinity was exploded, and they're still dealing with the...
Right.
We know it goes off. We know what happened with the nuclear arms race. I would have put on my Jack Warner. Hey, cut this fucking thing. 3 hours. I gotta show this movie 5 times. I can't do 3 times, 3 hours. Get the fuck out of here. Cut the fucking thing. Get those hearings off the fucking screen. God damn it. Whose name's on the water tower? Mine. Cut the fucking movie. God damn it. Boom.
That's the thing, Warner, what makes Warner Brothers, I mean, there's so many things that make a Warner movie, but historically it's, one thing that was with almost all the movies is pacing, right? Like Jack was always sitting in the editing room and he was always commenting, probably almost exactly like you just did. Like, let's move it. Let's keep the movie going. And that's why their movies are so punchy, and they still probably attract younger audiences that are used to movies with more pace. They can get behind classic Warner Brothers movies easier than maybe any other studio.
One of the things that's happened in current Hollywood, I don't want to hold up Oppenheimer as an example, but when you have a genius who's the director, there's no oversight. The power structure is completely changed.
When you look at the studio system, some of it was oppressive to the talent in a lot of ways, but the end result was what it was because there was all this oversight, right? There wasn't going to be a 3.5-hour movie because you got to play it so many times. But even as a result, even though one interest there is that we got to play it so many times because we got to make money, but the end result is maybe a better movie because now it's got pace and it rocks so fast. The movie has a punch that might not have been felt had it dragged out a lot longer.
And that discipline has been lost. I mean, I can say the example in the last script I wrote, people say, well, could we do this like as a limited series, meaning expand it? The older impulse is to pursue every storytelling efficiency you can find. And now it's like, how do we extend this? I subscribe to the other aesthetic. In my own movie, there's a scene I still look at, and I go, fuck, I could have cut that.
There's something refreshing, I think, watching an old movie today in this era of long television that might also attract new audiences to the past, just because it's time efficient, if anything.
Yeah, folks, you got to read the book. And as a companion piece to the book, you got to see the movies. Amongst those movies is The Solar Opposite. It's a romantic mockery about a comedian whose love life is a joke. It's all true, except for the happy parts, which I added. By the way, you mentioned Charles Champlin on a number of occasions in your book.
Oh, yeah, the critic, yeah.
Champlin was not only a critic, he did great features on Hollywood and...
Mm-hmm.
And when I was a kid in high school, my English teacher brought in Charles Champlin to give us a talk.
Cool.
And I'll never forget that. He was this very distinguished, gentlemanly figure. And he talked about movies. And, I knew my grandfather was this guy, but I didn't, might as well be, I was just a Valley kid playing baseball with Robin Yount, who's the star of the Milwaukee Brewers, or was. So then I make my movie, years later. And Champlin is pretty much retired, but he hosts a screening series at one of the big movie theaters in Orange County, a big movie theater. And so I wrote him a note about how I met him and sent him, at that time, a screener. And I was looking for exhibition. Fuck those distributors. Fuck them. I just went right to the theaters. If my grandfather could sell movies, so can Bill Kalmanson. If Ben can do it, Bill can do it. So I get a call. Bill, it's Charles Champlin. I saw your movie and I would love to include it in my screening series. And I said, okay, great. I got the cans, it wasn't the hard drive, it was fucking film. And Gilmo picks me up. I got some posters and I got this movie I'm trying to get play dates for. And eventually the Lemleys booked it, and that's how it got out. Warner Brothers turned it down. The guy, I forget the name, Barry Reardon was the head of distribution. I go, Mr. Reardon, you got to do it. My grandfather, you intern. What do you want from me? I can't do this movie. Well, later when it was the exhibition, the DVD and stuff, I was able to get a deal. So I drive down there. There's a line around this huge theater, and I meet Charles Champlin. He takes me out to dinner. We talk about the movie, and then they screen it. And there's these two director chairs, and everybody's there. And at the time, who knew? I could have been the next Quentin. I'm sitting there, and we're having this really talk. I mentioned, of course, my experience and memory of him coming into my English classes when I was a senior in high school, Mr. J's English class. And then he said to me, Bill, your movie reminded me so much of George Lucas's
American Graffiti
in terms of its authenticity to the time and the moment. And it felt so real and vivid. And
a great compliment.
Yeah, and it was in front of all these people. And then, it was Q&J. So people ask questions, I would tell a joke. And then that's what I do. And then afterwards, I had all these posters. The executives from Edwards Theater chain said, how do we book your movie? How do we get it? Because it played great. People loved it. Booked that movie, boom, ran the prints all over, did the Q&J. So I did the whole journey from writing, directing, finance, to distribution, exhibition.
Doing the PR, you're doing all of it.
The whole journey. Very few have done that. And I'm living proof that if you're white and you're privileged and you hang in there and you pay your dues and you stay disciplined and you never, ever let go of your dreams, you still might not make it. So I'm doing this podcast. Folks, I want to thank you for joining me with Chris Yogerst. Check out the new book, The Warner Brothers. It's once almost a Godfather story of a dysfunctional family, but in the midst of it all is the cultural history of the 20th century. It's all there. Great book. I recommend it. Till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namashaloha. See ya.